With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree. Look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tactics. We appreciate you being a part of the program, regardless of how you're joining us, whether you're on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Twitter, Twitch, Periscope, the terrestrial signal. However you're joining us this evening, we appreciate you joining us right here in the Situation Room, where tolerance isn't love, speech isn't violence, and disagreement isn't hate. We appreciate you being with the program as we do every single day, and today we actually do have a special guest, and we so often when we have guests on this program, when you hear guests on other programs, you're accustomed to it being somebody that is a representative, somebody that actually holds an elected office, but what you usually don't hear about are some of the people that work really hard behind the scenes. And I mean, occasionally you may see one of those people, but usually somebody wants to get someone that you're familiar with. I decided today to go a very different route and to sort of get somebody that's behind the scenes that you're not familiar with, but really does a lot of the work and sort of give us an inside look at how some of the sausage is made in DC and at the state level as well. This particular lady, her name is Caroline DeBerry. She is the Chief External Affairs Officer for Remote Area Medical. Somebody that, and she'll tell us a little bit more about what she's doing right now, and she is a former legislative assistant as well. So welcome onto the program, Caroline. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much, Caleb. It's a pleasure to be on. Thanks for asking me.
Oh, yeah. Well, we were really glad that you accepted the invitation. So if you would, before we delve off into some of the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about tonight, if you would just give our audience sort of a brief background, sort of your experience in Washington and policymaking.
Certainly. Well, I was a senior legislative assistant for Congressman John Duncan. He has now retired. He was the congressman for the Knoxville, Tennessee area for about 30 years. And I had a wide range of issues or portfolio assigned to me. And the main one I worked on was healthcare and then also defense. So that I was doing that for a few years in DC, and I also worked for the executive branch and got a real insight into the regulatory process working for the Federal Election Commission before that. So I was in DC over 6 years. Okay,
and now you're stationed in Knoxville.
That's correct. So now, as you said, I'm the Chief External Affairs Officer for a nonprofit that does a lot of work domestically, but actually does some international work as well. And so I'm kind of like their VP for government relations.
Okay, so are you technically considered a lobbyist, or do you have a staff of lobbyists, or how does that work?
No, you are correct. I am a lobbyist by law, and what I ended up learning whenever I took this job was that anyone that is paid to advocate on anybody's behalf to elected officials has to register as a lobbyist. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people kind of are like, oh, what is a lobbyist? And can kind of have a bad impression of them, but really lobbyists are educators.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that a lot of people, I think that when they hear the word lobbyist, they almost hear it like lobbyist. You know, there's that almost evil, connotation to it. But what I tell a lot of people is, well, you have to keep in mind that there are an awful lot of lobbyist groups that do represent citizens, and they actually pay lobbyists to try to inform people, because I don't care how smart you are. I don't care how educated you are or well-read you are on the issues. I fall into this category as well. There are certain areas I just have a lot of blind spots in because I'm not as well-versed in some of the specifics. And so having some lobbyists come and explain why some bills might be a good idea, why it might have some unintended consequences, that can actually be really helpful for representatives.
You're exactly right. You're hitting the nail on the head. And as a congressional staffer, I learned to appreciate that wealth of knowledge, because there are literally 5,000 to 6,000 pieces of legislation introduced in the House of Representatives every 2 years. That's a lot of bills. that's a lot of information that no one person, no even staff of 10 people could keep up with. And so having those lobbyists come in, sure, you learn where to trust and who to trust and what to look for as warning signs, but at the same time, they can really be helpful.
Well, and that's the thing. A lobbyist is just like any other profession. You have good lobbyists and you have bad lobbyists, just like you have good car mechanics and bad car mechanics, or good contractors and bad contractors. So
exactly,
I think the important thing to remember is that just because somebody's a lobbyist does not necessarily mean that they're, some evil corporate stooge funded by dark money or something. Like those people certainly exist, but that doesn't mean that every single one is like that.
Exactly. I dare to say the vast majority probably aren't.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably just folks trying to make their way in the world that are passionate about politics, just like a lot of my listeners. So
exactly.
If you could just sort of give us an inside look, sort of peel back the curtain and talk to us about how the legislative process works, and how, for example, if you could take us sort of step by step at how an idea that somebody has sort of evolves, gets written and becomes a law, winds up not even necessarily the process of it passing, just the process of it getting to the floor and a representative considering bringing it forward and co-sponsoring it.
I'd be happy to. And I've got a couple great examples that from my time as legislative assistant. A lady whose son passed away in our district contacted me, talked to me, and told me her son's story. He had passed away at the age of, I believe it was 7 years old, because the coach was not familiar with where the defibrillator was stored on the school property. And so the young boy passed away. So she was suggesting that any school that has a defibrillator have a training annually so that all the staff are aware where it is. And I thought it was a great idea. And I talked to Congressman Duncan about it, and he agreed it was a really great idea. So then my role as a legislative assistant was to try to draft language and then work with what are called legislative counsel. And it is a whole staff of lawyers that work for members of Congress, and their sole job is to author the actual legal language. So then once I worked with them, we went ahead and created a House resolution, and then the work began, which was to go around talking to every other congressional staffer, every member of Congress that would listen, and yes, lobbyists and other what some people call special interest groups, such as the American Heart Association or other entities. We ended up with 30 different organizations that were all focused on heart health, signing on to the legislation, saying it was a good idea, and it did end up passing the House unanimously. But it took most of 4 years to get it done.
Well, that's the thing about anything in government. The wheels of government tend to turn quite slowly. So, but a lot of that's done by design. I'm not going to get off into the theory of that, but I appreciate you using that as an example. I think that really helps bring it to life for a lot of people. When describing that process, I know that obviously whoever your elected official is, whether you're on the staff of a representative or a senator, that the staff plays a vital role in that, or else they wouldn't be there. And so I was just curious if you could give us maybe a percentage and explain why exactly how much of the work is done by the representative themselves and how much is done by the staff. I
think it's really percentages would be challenging to prescribe because it's really almost two separate jobs. The representative, the elected member, their job is largely to meet and listen to people and do their own study, but their role is very much more of a on the ground. You would not believe the schedules they keep. My boss was much older than me, and he put me to shame with how much energy and how much he put into his day. And so,
I was about to say, Representative Duncan was pretty on up there, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He was in his 70s by the time he retired. So yeah, he definitely put in long hours. And so then my role was to take meetings, obviously, that he couldn't, or different things like that. But it was also doing some additional deep research, trying to share with him anything I might hear that he didn't, or something like that. And it's kind of the role is more of a, you're behind the computer trying to study things out when you're not in meetings and things like that.
Right. And that was something that I was really interested in, because obviously they're more knowledgeable about some subjects than others. But typically, if they're going to co-sponsor a bill or something like that, it tends to be something that's kind of at least in their wheelhouse. And I didn't know, because I know they're knowledgeable about some of the subjects, but I didn't know how much of that was the staff and how much was them putting their own ideas and sort of stamping their own signature on that.
Those are great questions. Yeah, I would say it's a combination of all that because, for example, Congressman Duncan was really more of an expert in transportation and infrastructure, but I became very passionate about healthcare, and he was very supportive and was also very interested in healthcare, but really just ended up embracing that. And so then together we really tackled that issue, and he became known as a leader in healthcare, even though he was not on a committee that had jurisdiction over healthcare issues.
You know, I really do want to get into some policy things about healthcare in just a second, but before we do, one thing that I talk to some staffers and some of the people that work behind the scenes, and one thing that I find fascinating that I kind of wanted you to give some personal insight into. It's really weird not being the elected official, but then also knowing that your job is largely contingent upon an election. Like you may just be unemployed if your boss loses an election. And so I kind of wanted to give you the audience a sense of what is that like?
It requires a lot of heart behind the job. You have to really, really want to have that job. So I was very grateful that I had an opportunity to work for somebody that had very sure district. I mean, he there was no question that he could always get reelected. Mm-hmm. But what surprised me was when he decided he was going to go ahead and retire instead. And the day I found that out will forever be one of the worst days of my life. And so just because it was a shock, and especially if you get attached to the people that you're working with and all that, it's a challenging thing. But at the same time, you know, it's a wonderful opportunity. It's an opportunity to help people. So if you have the right heart for it, it's worth it. Whether you know, that uncertainty is worth it because you know how much you can try to do to help others in that whatever time you have.
Well, yeah, I know that you're really passionate about the work that you do, and I see some of your social media posts and that kind of thing, and it really does come through. So I was wondering, sort of along those same lines, do you think that it's possible that some of the bureaucrats that have been in office for a really long time, I mean, people that have held office for multiple decades, do you think maybe at least part of that motivation is they think, well, if I quit or I resign or I retire, then my whole staff has to find something else to do? I'm not saying that that would be the main motivation, but do you think that plays a role in their decision to run for office again?
I do. I think if you are dealing with a good person, and most likely you are, especially someone that has been in office for a long time, a lot of times the reason they are still in office is because they genuinely care about their staff, their constituents, and so on. And people recognize that, for better or for worse. Not saying that they're the greatest member of Congress or that their policies are all great. It's just that does require a lot of dedication on the part of the voters, the staff, and the member of Congress typically. You're exactly right.
Well, I mean, unless you're on Amy Klobuchar's staff, but you know, that might be a notable exception. But
yeah, just generally speaking,
you just out of curiosity, and I guess you don't have any inside information on this, but have you heard any of those rumors? Like, did you know them to be true, or was that just something that was, you know, not happening anywhere near you?
You, as a congressional staffer, you hear things, but you also kind of learn to just keep your mouth closed.
Okay, well,
at the time or in the future.
All right, well, I'll leave it at that. But because I did want to get into some policy issues, because here's the thing: I know that you're somebody that worked for a representative in the state of Tennessee, and I get that that's something that is not really local to Alabama. But it's a problem that's very similar. Tennessee and Alabama are culturally similar in a lot of ways. And the thing is, one thing that unfortunately we do share is that when it comes to rural healthcare, that's something that tends to be a really big issue in both states because we have a lot of rural areas. And I was just wondering, because this is something that is important to Alabamians, we have one of the highest infant mortality rates, partly because we have not as much variety of hospitals and not as many of them. If you're in some kind of accident or something like that, the mortality rate is higher for you in the state of Alabama. I'm sure it's at least similar in Tennessee for the same reason. You have a longer drive, a longer ambulance ride to get to the health care that you need. So I was just wondering, since you worked on this at the federal level, and I'm sure that your organization probably does some at the state level as well, what role do you think the Fed and the state governments ought to play in that?
Those are great questions. I think one of the roles that they have to play is to make sure that the roles they already have are being done well.
Mm-hmm.
The bigger question as to how much government should be involved in healthcare, that is a very big, broad question. But as far as rural healthcare, as far as the issues that we're facing right now, I could go on forever on that topic, because that was a key aspect to both, as you said, my current job, but as well as in my last job. And so, for example, hospital closures are such an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so for, to get even more specific, but not to get too much in the weeds, Medicare determines how much hospitals get reimbursed for the care they provide to Medicare patients.
Mm-hmm.
Medicare had a formula messed up for about 20 years. And that was one of the main things I worked on for the congressman. And we got a change under this administration. They had some people in there that were really willing to listen and recognize that those issues, those formulas, were contributing largely to hospital closures. So, the debate as to how much the government should have been involved already, that's another question. But to me, the bigger question now is, since the governments are so deeply involved,
mm-hmm.
they need to be being very careful to make sure that they're doing what they can to use their position correctly, as opposed to further harming rural hospitals or something like that.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, and this is something that comes as a struggle for me, because I tend to be very libertarian on these issues. I'm very much
mm-hmm.
a big C capitalist free market kind of guy, but at the same time, I also realize that if we rip the rug out of them, if we sort of rip the Band-Aid off in one fell swoop and leave the hospitals with absolutely no funding, that they just got it and then overnight take it away, that's going to cause all kinds of problems. And so for somebody like me, I don't even know if you're a libertarian. I don't know how conservative or liberal you may be if we were to gauge your personal political beliefs on that scale. But just coming at it from that perspective, sort of my perspective, what would you recommend? Is there a way to sort of wean hospitals off that and strengthen them? Or do you think that we actually need to go in the opposite direction and increase government funding, increase their reliance on government? Like, where do you stand on that?
Well, and so I can speak from a personal perspective that I definitely am leaning towards the conservative side of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I can also speak, that's taking my employer hat off, but
Sure.
to don back the hat of remote area medical, the nonprofit I work for. They're an ideal example to me of a private public partnership.
Mm-hmm.
So the nonprofit I work for is entirely privately funded. Our clinics receive no federal or state funding, but yet we are able to provide millions of dollars worth of healthcare to hundreds of thousands of people all over the country that otherwise would not be able to receive it. Now, we have a unique partnership with the United States Public Health Service, which is one of the 7 uniformed services, kind of like the Army, Navy, but they just don't carry weapons. And they help us because they can cross state lines when they're deployed. And so you kind of run into a situation where state regulations can actually get in the way of people having free healthcare. And that's one of the things we encounter because... So
you're saying even free healthcare that is provided by private dollars is sometimes inhibited by state regulation?
Exactly. And That is one of the main issues I work with in my current job is... Alabama is actually one of the states that the laws on the books were written to, of course, protect their citizens. The idea was they wrote how it is that you become a licensed doctor or a licensed dentist or whatever. And that was years ago before our society was quite so mobile. And I don't mean just in technology. I mean just even, moving from state to state, traveling across state lines so much. In a lot of cases, these are just antiquated laws. But these laws are written so that if you're a Tennessee doctor wanting to come and volunteer and provide free healthcare services to somebody in the state of Alabama, you probably can't. The state of Tennessee is kind of the gold standard It passed a volunteer healthcare service provider law. There's various names for it, but the whole point of the law is if you're a licensed provider, you have a good license in another state, then you can come into our state to provide services on a short-term basis. And so there are several states that have passed that: Utah, Missouri, Tennessee, even Connecticut is more friendly than a lot of other states to volunteers. It's actually not that challenging, especially when the licensing boards realize you're not trying to reinvent the wheel and tell them how to license their own doctors. It's not about that. It's just about increasing access to free healthcare at no cost to the government.
Right. Well, that's really fascinating, and I would totally support a bill like that. I'm going to go ahead and tell you now, and this is sort of showing the other side of the coin, that if that happens, and that is proposed in the state of Alabama, Alabama's politics is a good old boys club, just like it is in a lot of states. And there are going to be lobbyists, the bad lobbyists, not to paint with a broad brush here, but there are going to be lobbyists that will see that as a threat to Alabama doctors and try to keep that from happening. So I'd actually be more than willing to talk to a couple of my friends in government to see if they might be interested in drafting some legislation like that. But it's going to take a couple of years, and even then, I'm not sure it would pass for that exact reason. But
well, that's a good point.
Yeah.
But the good news is the patients that we and other nonprofits like us see are the ones that would never go to the doctor anyway. So we're not taking a source of funds or income from these doctors or hospitals or providers or whatever, because these are just people that just wouldn't go anyway.
And I totally agree with you. And I kind of thought
right.
of that, but you're right. There's still going to be people that oppose it for exactly that reason. They'll see it as somebody trying to horn in on the market. Would you say that because I know that the biggest debate in the country right now when it comes to healthcare is, did Obamacare actually work? Because you've got some people on the right that are saying, no, it didn't work. We need to repeal it, and we actually need to go further and really deregulate the market. Then you've got sort of the Joe Biden camp, which is Obamacare worked really well. We might need to tweak it a little bit, but it's working really well, and it did what it said it would do. And then you have actually, ironically, the vast majority of or at least seemingly the majority of the left, certainly the loudest voices on the left, are saying, no, Obamacare didn't work, and we have to go further in the other direction and go for socialized medicine, Medicare for all, whatever label you want to slap on it. And so would you, in your characterization as somebody that's actually worked with this and worked with healthcare providing facilities, would you say that Obamacare helped or hurt the healthcare system, and what conclusions should we draw from that?
So just to clarify, I am taking my remote area medical cap back off.
Right, so
but yeah,
this is just Caroline's opinion here.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So as a congressional staffer, yes, I was helping the congressman during that one of the greatest repeal and replace Obamacare votes and time periods. Mm-hmm. And I heard every day from providers and patients alike the problems that were caused by Obamacare. Mm-hmm. I will never forget the story I heard from a young woman about my age that had not been able to find a job. And then the individual mandate was assessed on her. She was penalized for not being able to have health insurance because she couldn't afford it. Mm-hmm. She had to take out credit card debt in order to pay that individual mandate. And then the cycle continued actually for more than 1 year. I know that the individual mandate was in essence repealed, but it still is an example of how the law had an unintended consequence. A similar situation was that, again, Obamacare just had a lot of unintended consequences. A lot of providers found that it was not helping them with their processes. It was not helping them from a financial standpoint, partly because a lot of their patients ended up not being able to go to them anymore because the insurance companies really did not allow people to keep their doctors as everybody thought it would. And then from a standpoint of even particular types of patients with very extreme pre-existing conditions, mm-hmm. There was a group of, I believe it was over 300 different organizations representing patients that were, either cancer patients, MS patients, so on, that found that insurance companies were still finding ways to get around the law And they were actually finding that their insurance options were worse than they were before. And they wrote then the Health and Human Services Secretary under Obama asking for help because the law was still not closing those loopholes at all.
Well, see, and that was the thing that a lot of conservatives like myself were saying before the thing ever passed, is that insurance companies are going to figure out a way around denying people with pre-existing conditions. And so but they'll have to accept at least some of them, which means that the costs are going to go up. So what you're going to wind up with is some people getting denied coverage based on pre-existing conditions, and still also having the insurance itself be more expensive. And so you wind up with the same problem, only exponentially worse, because now everybody's premiums have gone up. But anyway,
correct.
But yeah, I think that was the main thing. This is a 2,000-page bill, and I think that I genuinely say this, and I know that a lot of my conservative brethren actually get mad at me when I say this. I think the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of the Democrats that passed that bill really did have good intentions, and they really believed it was going to help people. I think there were some that were just power hungry, but there were a lot that genuinely thought it was going to help people, and it just did not work out the way that they thought it would. But it did become something that even hurt me personally. I was one of the 29ers. One of the people that had like 3 part-time jobs at one time just to make ends meet, and I couldn't go full-time in any of them because the cost of providing health care, if I worked 30 hours a week, would be so great that it would no longer justify the work that I was trying to do. And so I couldn't get promoted, I couldn't move up, and I had to have several different jobs at once just to be able to stay basically running, if you've ever heard Alice in Wonderland, running in place just to not fall behind. Mm-hmm. And that's what it felt like. But
that
anyway.
Makes sense. And it's interesting that you point out the law of unintended consequences. I think you mentioned that earlier, and I was mentioning it. And one of the main people I learned it from was one of the main lawyers to help write the legislative text of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And he pointed out to me when we were working on a legislative idea that you got to keep in mind the law of unintended consequences. And your situation is a perfect example of one of those unintended consequences.
Oh, absolutely. And as my audience knows very well, because I've talked about it on the air several times, that also was a big hindrance to me because, of course, I got diagnosed with cancer when I was 28. But Carolina, I did want to ask you about this before we go, because I think that even though, of course, we're both political nerds and we could talk about this all day, I don't want to keep you longer than I'm supposed to. And I know we both have we've both got places to go. So I wanted to ask you this, because I think that this may be the most important question that I've asked all day. What role does your faith play in this? Because, I mean, I met you at church. I know that you're very strong in your faith. And so when you're in that, and let's be honest, Washington can be a very corrupt, evil place, depending on where you go. There's a lot of dirty money in politics. There's a lot of people that will that are basically willing to sell their soul for political gain. And so when you're surrounded by that constantly, what role does your faith play in that job, and what role does your faith play in the job you have now?
Well, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it, because you're exactly right. It is the most important question or anybody can be asked. My faith is absolutely critical. Without it, I wouldn't be where I am today, and I wouldn't have served the government for as many years as I did, or do the job as a lobbyist that I do now with a clear conscience if I hadn't had my faith. Because I believe that nothing is impossible with God. And if you are determined to make the right choices and be motivated by a desire to truly help others, not to pursue power or money or influence or whatever. If you are wanting to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, the Lord will make a way. And it may not even be the way you anticipate, but He will make a way. And I got to see that over and over again. And so, yeah, it's a very much this career, oddly enough, this career is actually a spiritually based decision, a spiritual journey for me. And that's why I love it so much.
Well, I'd kind of like to get and I don't know if you have any personal stories or not on this, but I'd kind of like to get the other side of that. Were there people in Washington, other staffers, people that were sort of floating around Congress, lobbyists, that kind of thing, that you could really tell that they didn't have that sort of solid ground, that compass that moral compass that always pointed north because it was being guided by Scripture and by faith? And how did that affect them?
Oh, indeed. It's sad to say, but you're exactly right. It is very much a corrupt city, and to an extent, all the bad stories you hear, they're usually often true. But there are still a lot of good people out there that do believe in God or do have the right motives. But you definitely get some very interesting reactions when you're one of the only ones in a room that wants to talk about doing the right thing in the right way. You get some interesting reactions. And some of them, they're curious. It's inspiring to them. It gives them hope. It makes them feel like, oh, wow, there's someone else out there that really kind of wants to do what I wish I could do. But then you'll also get others that aren't happy with it and will oppose you as hard as they possibly can to protect whatever it is that they have, whether it's the power or the money or whatever.
Well, I think that that's probably true in any job, that you're going to have similar reactions to actually living out your faith. And I think it's a sad testament to the way things are in America, is that you're kind of a outsider, not necessarily because you're somebody that refers to yourself as a Christian, because that doesn't make you an outsider, but someone that actually lives out their faith and tries to do the things that their faith teaches. That's kind of makes you a rare animal nowadays. And I think that, just the average person, regardless of their job, meets with those reactions. I would imagine, though, in Washington that they're a little bit more, what's a good word here?
Intense?
Yeah, that's actually, yeah. See, I'm the communication major, and my guest is the one that has to come up with my words for me.
Not at all. I apologize for interrupting.
No, not. I ask for it. So, but no, that was a good one to use. Yeah, just a little bit more, a little bit more intense on that. Maybe something that is going to be more noticeable to other people, a more visceral reaction.
You're exactly right, and the emotions run incredibly high, and it can be a life and death situation. Yeah. Right and wrong can become a life and death situation. And a lot of people just don't think that that's true in this country, but it actually is. Not to the same extent necessarily, not in the most overt ways necessarily even as in some other countries. But if you're standing firm, hard, and long enough, it can get dangerous, either to your own health, to the people that you care about, or even just from a professional standpoint. That's almost a guarantee. You're taking your professional career future into your own hands, so to speak, and really you're putting it into the Lord's hands, but by standing for what's right. But it can even become a threat to your physical safety.
Yeah, I really do pray that never actually happened to you. I don't know if it has or not, but I've heard that so many times from politicians that I interview, that when they go to Washington, sometimes they'll say it on air, sometimes they don't dare say it on air, but they'll even tell me under their breath when the mics are off, they'll say, that is the most corrupt city I have ever been to. If anything that you want to do evil, you can do in DC. If you know where to look.
That's probably true.
And it's just it's kind of like there's a lot of ways to do a lot of good, because it is a city that is so corrupt, but there's also a lot of ways that the city can corrupt you if you're not, really solid in your faith.
I agree completely. I agree with the others that you have spoken with, and including from the standpoint of, there again, that goes back to nothing's impossible with God. And if you have that faith, and then also it makes it a unique opportunity, because there's perhaps a smaller percentage of those that are actually trying to do the right thing. So there's even more for you to do if you are trying to do the right thing.
It's a good way to look at it.
That's a positive way of looking at it. And then you're right. It's really true, though, that almost anywhere you live and work, you're going to run into the same common ideas and tendencies, human nature tendencies, towards jealousy or anger or hatred or power, greed, so on. You'll run into those almost everywhere. It's just, you're talking on a national scale with the media around every corner and everybody being a reporter with a camera in their hand. It's a little different up there. And so then, emotions are running higher and stakes are higher, but it's the same wherever you work.
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly how I would have phrased it, the stakes being higher, because a lot of our listeners, they pay really close attention to state and local politics. And guys, I'm telling you, as corrupt as it is here, just think about how much worse it is when the stakes are really high in DC. And that's, unfortunately something that is true, but, you do the best that you can and hope that you make a positive influence and maybe leave the city and the nation in a better state than when you showed up. But thanks so much. We greatly appreciate you being with us, Caroline, and wish the best for you. Hope the best for Remote Area Medical. Sounds like they're doing some great work, and we hope the Lord blesses that endeavor.
Well, thank you so much. I wish the same for you, and thanks again for having me on.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and I will talk to you later. Have a good one.
You too.
That was Caroline DeBerry, who is a Chief External Affairs Officer for Remote Area Medical. And as always, we really appreciate her taking time out of her day to be with us. We'll be back in just a moment. And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us on this Friday evening special edition of Tactics. Now, I did want to get to a couple of local stories. We went ahead and had our guest, as we usually do at the beginning of the episode whenever we do have guests, but there are a couple of local stories, and we're not going to do a super deep dive into them, but I think it's important to bring them up, and sadly, this is the way that it goes sometimes in the news business. You have some things that kind of drop later on in the week, and so we wanted to make you aware of those. First up is that Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama has already come out and announced that he has backed Jeff Sessions, which comes as a surprise to nobody. I mean, he actually already said this, I don't know, a couple of months ago, before Jeff Sessions was even really playing with the idea of jumping into the race. And for those of you that watched our show yesterday, you know that Jeff Sessions did announce he qualifies today, which is the qualifying deadline for the Republican primaries in the Senate seat. Jeff Sessions trying to take his old Senate seat back. So I don't think that this really surprises anybody. Senator Shelby, I believe, kind of misses his dancing partner. And I don't mean that to be derogatory in any way. I just think that Shelby was very comfortable having Sessions around. He's somebody that has worked with Sessions for decades, knows the guy really well, and that's a good contact. I think he would personally prefer Sessions to be in the seat over anybody else. But along those same lines, I had a really fascinating question posed to me by a friend of mine, another Caleb, actually. He's a fraternity brother, really good guy. And he actually brought this up. If Jeff Sessions were not in the race, if Jeff Sessions decided to not get back into the race, he thinks that Senator Shelby would actually secretly prefer Doug Jones to any of the other people running. And I thought about that for a second. And the truth is, he's probably right. And for those of you that have been watching the program for a while, and especially those that were around during Shelby's last primary, know I'm not a huge Senator Shelby fan. I mean, I don't completely dislike him. He does some conservative things every now and then. His voting record is not abysmal. It's certainly nothing to be proud of, but it's not terrible. And there are some things to like about Shelby, but overall, I think that he's just been in office way too long. He likes to side with the Democrats a little too often. This is a guy that is a former Democrat. He voted against, for example, Bill Clinton's impeachment. I don't know. I think that it's certainly true that Senator Shelby it's time for him to move on, essentially. And when it comes to him and Jeff Sessions, I think that you could actually say something similar about him. I think that there is a legitimate argument, and we went over this a little bit yesterday, that even if you're a conservative and you like Jeff Sessions and have for a long time, if you're somebody that believes in term limits, believe that people don't need to stay in office too long, I can see a compelling case for, well, Sessions is an establishment guy. He's been there for a really long time. Let's get some fresh blood in there and somebody that's going to be a senator for a long time. Shelby, however, is most comfortable with Sessions, and out of the field that we have right now, I think the only exception to that rule that Caleb talked about, in other words, the exception to, well, he would have preferred Doug Jones to any of the other Republicans, I think that's certainly true with Tommy Tuberville. I think that you could make a compelling case for that being true with John Merrill, and I think that's definitely true with Roy Moore. So that really leaves the only exception to the rule, and that is Bradley Byrne. Well, I mean, Arnold Mooney, but I don't think Sessions even has an opinion on Arnold Mooney. Frankly, I don't think he would waste his time trying to form one. By the way, that is not a crack against Arnold Mooney. I'm pretty sure Senator Shelby doesn't have an opinion on me either. I'm just saying that because Mooney's not really a contender for this seat, he doesn't have nearly the name recognition to make a dent in this. He has no chance of winning at this point. I just don't see Shelby putting forward the mental the mental strain, I guess would be the best way to say it, the mental energy to even form an opinion on Mooney. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But I think that he probably would secretly, if he were being honest, he would probably prefer everybody except for Jeff Sessions and Bradley Byrne. I think he would prefer Doug Jones to everybody in the field. The reason that I say that Bradley Byrne is a notable exception, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, I don't know, but the reason I believe that he is a notable exception is primarily that he is somebody that has a decent amount of legislative experience. Bradley Byrne has been in office as a representative in the House for some time now. He's somebody that's familiar with Washington. He knows about drafting legislation. He knows sort of the players in D.C. He's not going to be somebody that's just a fresh face going into there. And because of that, and by the way, fresh face isn't necessarily always a compliment. I mean, look at AOC. But I think with Bradley Byrne, I think that Shelby would actually prefer Bradley Byrne, who would side with him voting-wise more often than Doug Jones would. But, you know, that's just a theory. I don't know Senator Shelby that well. I know of him more through the media, more like you guys do than anything else. I've only met him once. But it was an interesting thought, and I really do think that because of Shelby does like an establishment guy, and he likes somebody that has some experience, is going to be able to move and shake a little bit while he's up there. I think that he would prefer Bradley Byrne to Doug Jones, but I think that his support for pretty much everybody else is not going to be there. Tubbs is a complete outsider. John Merrill is, I mean, he's an executive officer. He's not a legislator. I think that's what Shelby would pick. Right now, like I've said before, John Merrill would be my pick, but, you know, that's just me. And speaking of elections, we actually have some election news of somebody else jumping into a different election, and that is, of course, Barry Moore, who has stepped into the 2nd District race. Now, Barry Moore is somebody that I've interviewed, I think, at least twice. He's been a representative in the House, really sharp guy at State House, of course, in Montgomery, in Alabama, not at the national level, which he's running for now. Barry Moore's a good dude. I think that he has a fairly conservative voting record. It's not the most conservative. I mean, he's not like an uber conservative. But, you know, as far as the principles of limiting spending, small government, his record is pretty good. It's not the best, but it's decent. And when you compare that to everything else here, and then you compare that to the other people that he would be running against, frankly, I'd probably vote for Barry Moore if the election were held today. Now, that's a long time off. I have not made my mind up yet who I'm going to vote for District 2, and you guys know me. I like to wait until the absolute last minute to actually make that decision. But, you know, if you're asking me right now, who do you vote for in that race, and I am a District 2 voter, I probably pull the lever for Barry Moore. Because there is absolutely no way in Hades I'm voting for Troy King. I'm not kidding here, and I know that I'm a guy that tends to go third party. You guys know that. 100% cards on the table. I'd vote for a Democrat before I'd vote for Troy King. Of course, Troy King is a Democrat, so that's kind of I mean, I know he's a Republican technically, but he's been a Democrat before. He's always done whatever he thought was necessary to obtain power. Troy King's one of the most corrupt officials in the history of the state of Alabama. And yes, I am stacking him up against people like Bentley. I'm stacking him up against other governors that we've had in the past. Don Siegelman, guys like that. Looking at him compared to those guys, what Troy King did was actually far worse than what Governor Bentley did. From a violating the public trust standpoint, from a corruption standpoint. I think that, he and Mike Hubbard would be basically neck and neck, but the difference is Troy King got away with it for a lot longer. But anyway, that kind of gives you a summary of where I am on him. And with Jessica Taylor, and by the way, I have reached out to Jessica Taylor multiple times through multiple venues. She has yet to get back with me. She has expressed absolutely no interest in talking to me whatsoever. I'm going to try to get an interview with her, but so far, she has not been very open to having a conversation with media personalities. I don't know if she's hitting the pavement. I don't know if she's going out and campaigning much. I haven't really seen anything about it in the news. But right now, Jessica Taylor, I see her kind of hiding. Now, I've seen some of her political ads, and I've seen some of her talking points and been to her website. Here's what I'll say about her. She talks a good game. And that's good, that's important. But I want you to remember this. Martha Roby also talked a good game. When Martha Roby was originally elected, one of the things that she talked about was being more conservative. When she took down Bobby Bright, she wanted to do all these things like repeal Obamacare and limit government spending, rein in the national debt. I mean, she talked like she was going to be a Mo Brooks or a Louis Gohmert, somebody of that caliber in the House of Representatives for Alabama. And when I first heard about her, I was a big Martha Roby supporter. And to show you how far I've come in that, when Martha Roby announced she was no longer seeking re-election in District 2, I literally threw a party on air. I had my background back here changed to a big banner that said, "Bye, Martha." I set off a confetti bomb, which, by the way, I kid you not, I'm still digging confetti out of furniture here in the Situation Room. But anyway, so, it's safe to say that I really don't like Martha Roby. And what it all boils down to is she talked like a conservative, spoke as though she wanted to be a conservative, and spoke as though she was going to be something the people of Alabama could trust to bring their conservative values to Washington and represent them. And then, she actually votes with the Democrats about half the time. And on top of that, if you're looking at her rating from places like Conservative Review, Freedom Works, the Heritage Foundation, all conservative think tanks, every single one of them had her at a lower rating than the Democrat that she replaced, Bobby Bright. I mean, she was failing in every conceivable rubric that you could measure. She was getting I think it was like the highest score that she got on one of them was a 56, 57, something like that. So by every rubric, by every standard that does these things and evaluates Congress people's votes, she was failing on every level. I mean, she was, other than Terry Sewell, the only Democrat in the Alabama delegation. She had a worse freedom score than all of them. It wasn't even close. And so the reason that I'm skeptical of Jessica Taylor is not that I don't think that she seems like a nice conservative lady, and I have no reason to assume that she's going to pull a Martha Roby on us. But if I have to pick between somebody like Barry Moore that has a voting record that I can actually look at, I know what I'm getting when I look at a Barry Moore, versus somebody that's never held office, doesn't have an official voting record, by the way, much like Martha Roby when she first got into this. I'm not trying to be prejudiced against people that haven't run for office before, but I'm just looking at that and I smell trouble. I think that she could be very similar to a Martha Roby who talks a really good game, talks about how conservative that she's going to be. and then gets up in Washington and does the exact opposite. And I'll say this when it comes to her media relations. At least Martha Roby communicated with the media before she got elected. Now, granted, the second that she won election, she cut us off and never spoke to us again. I mean, I reached out to her campaign I don't know how many times, and Martha Roby never wanted to come on my show. All she wanted to do was buy ads so that you could hear her in a pre-recorded message as opposed to talking directly to you, the listener and the voter, the constituent in the state of Alabama. But Jessica Taylor's starting out that way. She doesn't even want to talk to us now. That makes me suspicious. It's almost like she doesn't really know what she believes yet. Maybe I'm completely wrong. And by the way, Jessica Taylor, feel free to come on my show anytime. You have a standing invitation. I'll be happy to have you on. I want to have that conversation. And I'm not going to, sandbag you. That's not what I'm about. You can ask even people that disagree with me, Democrats that come on this program, that I don't do that to people. And if it comes between her and Troy King, if Barrymore drops out for some reason, oh yeah, you better believe I'll vote for her over Troy King, because I'd rather take a gamble on somebody that at least talks a good game and talks like a conservative, but has no record to back it up, over somebody like Troy King that has a very clear record of doing the exact opposite of that. So I'm definitely open to having my mind changed. There's a lot of time between now and the Republican primary. And I am more than willing to hear Miss Taylor or any other candidates out. But right now, if you ask me who I was voting for in this election, I would have to go with Barrymore. I think that he'd be the right man for the job, at least out of the people that I have seen thus far. I'm not opposed to voting for Jessica Taylor. I would definitely consider it. It's not as though she has an unwinnable vote for me. It's just she's going to have to do some very serious convincing that she's not all talk. And I think that that's fair. And in other local news, this involves somebody that's actually a friend of the program. You're all familiar with the Foundation for Moral Law if you've been watching my program for any amount of time. The Foundation for Moral Law, of course, is an organization that deals specifically with matters of religious liberty, and they're located right here in the state capitol. Well, I'm good friends with one of the attorneys there. I'm and also a former employee of theirs, and I know a few people down there, really, really good folks, very patriotic, God-fearing, and I've had I think at least 3 of their attorneys on my show at one time or another. So I have close ties to them. Full disclosure. They actually have recently signed an amicus brief and sent it to the Supreme Court, saying that the Supreme Court should take the case of the Little Sisters of the Poor. Now, I'm not going to get into all the legalese because, frankly, I don't think that I could do it justice, and also because I would really like to just get somebody from the Foundation for Moral Law in here to explain it, and they'll be able to explain it better, so I'm not going to just butcher it here so that they can come back and correct my mistakes later. What we'll do is we'll just try to have somebody in to explain all of this to you, but suffice it to say that the Little Sisters of the Poor, who were Catholic nuns that refused to comply with a portion of Obamacare that required they provide contraceptives to their female employees, they're Catholic, so they don't believe in contraceptives. This is the brief that is basically coming to their defense and saying that the Supreme Court should be taking this issue up and make a solid, distinct, very clear understanding of what the law is in this respect. So first of all, from a logistical standpoint, this is going to do very little to curtail Obamacare. When you're talking about something like the individual mandate, which has now technically been repealed, that's something that created injury to the Obamacare law as a whole. Like if you were to think of it as a building, taking out the individual mandate was like major foundational damage. I mean, that was taking out several load-bearing walls. And so it is something that is important, and the court is actually trying to parse through right now whether or not taking out that massive pillar that was holding up so much of the weight in Obamacare is something that means that Obamacare as a whole has to go. And that's partially because the original argument in the first Obamacare case, the one where Roberts, completely betrayed the country, when it comes to that case, one of the arguments that was made there is you cannot separate the individual mandate from Obamacare. If you take out the mandate, you have to take Obamacare out altogether. They're not separable, if that's even a word. So that was the original argument, and now that the mandate is gone, the court is going to have to decide for themselves whether or not it stays or not. This is not a case like that. I think it's a very important case for very different reasons. But even if the Little Sisters of the Poor won an unequivocal victory, like with no conditions, yep, the Little Sisters of the Poor were right, you cannot force somebody to purchase something against their will by law if it's something that violates their religious freedom. If that's what the court finds, and I hope it is, actually, I'd rather them just find that the government cannot compel an individual citizen to purchase anything. That's be actually the preferable, whether you include religious liberty or not. That would be the preferable outcome, at least so far as I stand. But the reason this one is important is not because it creates some kind of big blow to Obamacare, because it doesn't. If this is decided in their favor, Obamacare is still going to stand, and it's really going to be structurally pretty much exactly the same as it was before that took place. You're going to see very, very little contrast between before this case, after this case. You're just not going to see a lot of variation there. So the reason that this one is important is primarily because it will set a precedent on religious liberty. It will set a precedent on, can the government compel a private citizen to violate their religious principles? Because it's one thing for the government not to go in and violate a religious principle. I mean, that's a whole different thing. For example, a religious institution, whatever it may be. It's different for it. The best way to describe this is, let's say that there were pagans and they wanted to, let's say, sacrifice a child. Well, you can't use religious liberty as a defense for that because you'd be breaking a law. Your practice cannot do that. But the difference here is, this is a government compelling you not to stop a action that's a religious practice. They're asking you to engage in a practice that is against your religious beliefs. That's the difference. And so it will be really interesting to see if the Supreme Court finds one way or the other, because for a long time, you've had groups like, for example, the Amish that don't pay taxes. They have a religious exemption. And for the longest time, the government has seen religious liberty as more important than complying with the law when it comes to the person taking an action. If you're a pacifist, for example, you should be able to have a religious objection. If you want to be a conscientious objector, that should be up to you. I may disagree with your decision. I may think that your religion teaching that is incorrect. But the difference is, if your religion does do that, it says you are not allowed to engage in X practice, then I think that religious liberty is a perfectly valid reason for you to back out of that. Because there is a huge difference in the government saying, no, you can't do that because it breaks a law, regardless of whether or not your religion preaches that you have to do it. There's a big difference in that in saying, no, we don't care what your religion says, you are going to engage in this practice because we tell you you have to. That's a whole different ball of wax. But anyway, that's why I think that case is so important, is because what really it does in the long run is it strikes at the core of this idea of public versus private. And that's important, and that has an important implication for churches as well. We saw just recently that Bob Francis, who is no longer in the race now, of course you all heard that last week he conceded, he's dropped out of the race, but Bob Francis, skater boy Bob Francis, up there saying, you know what, we can't give gifts to churches and stuff that say that homosexuality is wrong. Man, it's really hard to say homosexuality in a skater boy voice. But anyway, but that was Bob Francis's stance. And the reason this case is actually really important to that is because if we're going to set a precedent that just because you are open to the public, be you a business or a nonprofit institution, like in this case with the Little Sisters of the Poor, a religious institution like they are, that just because you are generally open to the public and because you provide services to the public, that does not make you a public entity. That does not make you essentially an offshoot of the state that has to accommodate everybody. Your business is still your property. Your property, physical property, a building or a spot of land is still your property. And just because you are generally open to the public and people in the public can enter your business, that does not mean that all of a sudden you're a government entity that has to accommodate everybody. And that's what this case really strikes at the heart of. Because if you're a government entity, sure, I totally understand, not necessarily contraceptives because it's not a necessary medical need, but I understand the idea that governments can't discriminate against people. We need to be accommodating. But if you're an actual religious institution, or if you're just a regular nonprofit that has no religious affiliation at all, or you're a private business that's in it to make money, the government still has absolutely no business telling you what you must and must not provide for your employees or your customers. The problem at the core of this issue is that largely the left, they see that if you start a business or you even go out in public or you're generally open to the public, that you have to abide by their rules. That's not the way this is supposed to work. We're not supposed to have to go to the government to ask permission for every little thing that we do. We're supposed to be free individuals, and that would, by the way, extend to groups, because groups are of course made up of individuals, and we have freedom of assembly in this country. And so because of that, when it's a private entity, we should be able to largely set the tone, the practices, and the speech that goes on inside that place, as long as we're not breaking any laws. And the laws should never be formed in such a way that they create some kind of burden upon us, like providing contraceptives if you're Catholic. For the record, I have no problem with contraceptives. Despite being a very religious person, I belong to a church that doesn't see any problem with them. I don't see anything in the scripture that would bar someone from using contraceptives. And so I don't have any problem with it. If a young lady came to me and asked me whether or not she should be using the contraceptives, I'd say, well, the Bible doesn't really address that. That's perfectly fine with me. But Catholics believe differently. And just because I believe differently than them does not mean that I should not be understanding and worried about their religious liberty too. Because if they can make Catholics provide contraceptives, how long does it take before they can force Christians to support abortions or to pay for them? It's not a very far bridge. If this goes on unimpeded, that is going to be the next step. They're already advocating for that in certain places. But that being said, let's go ahead and, it looks like we've been, I'll just go ahead and go to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
Today's daily dose of stupid, we actually have a double daily dose of stupid, because I know that I haven't done as many episodes here recently, so here we are. We're giving you a double dose. You're getting double the stupid. You're welcome. So, the daily dose of stupid today comes from Hillary Clinton, which I know comes as no surprise. She's been the topic of our daily dose of stupid many, many times. Not nearly as many as AOC, but many times. So, here's Hillary Clinton. She says, and I do love it when Hillary Clinton's in the spotlight. I really do. Every time she jumps into the spotlight, she reminds America why she is not president. But she was doing a book tour the other day, and she said, and I'm not paraphrasing, this is a direct quote, I'm reading it off of the paper, "We have to hope that whoever ends up nominated," talking about the Democrats, "can win the Electoral College." Well, yeah, that if you're a Democrat, that would be the hope. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by the legend in broadcasting, John Madden. And I love John Madden because if that man can make a living in broadcasting, I know for a fact that I can with some of the things that he says. So John Madden said one time, usually the team that scores the most points wins the game. Yep. Yeah, John Madden. Hillary Clinton doing her best political John Madden impersonation saying, well, we would hope that whoever gets nominated would win the Electoral College. Well, that's how you become president. Yes, that is. So that would in turn be how you would hope for, because it wouldn't really do you any good to nominate somebody who couldn't win the Electoral College. That would kind of be pointless. So good job, Hillary Clinton. If only Democrats had taken her advice in 2016, they might have a president right now. If only they had gone with somebody that was not Hillary Clinton and nominated somebody that actually could win the Electoral College, maybe she would have had an actual chance. But that moves us into our second dose, our second daily dose of stupid. A birth coach in the United Kingdom, over in jolly old London, was actually hounded out of a job by the trainee mob. Ooh, that rhymes. I didn't even mean that to happen. So here's a report from the Daily Mail, of course, a publication over there in the UK. Lindsay McCarthy Calvert, 45, was forced to stand down as spokesperson for the DOLA UK and has since resigned altogether from the National Organization for Birth Coaches. Her exit comes after transgender rights activists triggered an investigation in which DOLA UK concluded her message breached its equality and diversity guidelines. Now, it's important to note here, because I don't want to get my facts wrong, they didn't fire her. She resigned under pressure. Now, whether or not they took her in a back room somewhere and the board said, look, it would really help us out if you would just go ahead and step down, I don't know that. Because the reporting isn't there. This is a private organization. We don't know. But the point is, officially, she resigned. She was not actually fired. However, it's very clear based on this and based on the reporting from the Daily Mail, which, let's be honest, is not exactly a right-wing publication, that the reason she was forced out was because of her comments and her commentary on transgenderism. So what was this controversial opinion that she had? What was the thing that was so evil that she had to be forced out of her own job? Well, here it is. Cancer Research UK ads claimed that a pap smear is, quote, relevant for anyone aged 25 to 64 with a cervix. Now, this is an obvious pander to the transgender community because they said anyone with a cervix. Well, why wouldn't you just say women? Why wouldn't you just say women ages 25 to 65? That's much easier. It makes more sense. It's going to cause more interest. It'll make the ad more effective, actually. I mean, just from an advertising perspective, and keep in mind I'm somebody that's done that side of broadcasting too, it makes a lot more sense to say women because that creates an instant connection between the person reading it and the person that the person reading it and the ad maker, the person that's trying to convey the message. So it makes far more sense from an advertising perspective to just say women. But no, they said anybody with a cervix between these age groups. So Calvert, the lady in question here, responded with this Facebook post. Quote, I am not a cervix owner. I am not a menstruator. I am not a feeling. I am not defined by wearing a dress and lipstick. I am a woman, an adult human female. I am 100% on board with this because one of the things she's bringing up here, I'm not just my body parts, nor am I just a feeling, and anybody that has that feeling is now a woman. I'm a woman. I was born a woman. My DNA says that I'm a woman. She's a woman. And it is absolute madness to engage in this fantasy world that the left wants us to be in now, where that is not true, where you're just a woman because you felt that way, or you're just a cervix. You're not a real woman. You're just a cervix owner. You just happen to have a female body. That doesn't make you a woman. Well, yes, it does. It absolutely does. There's something special and important about being a woman, and what the left has sought to do, ironically, a lot of them feminist, has tried to make being a woman into an intangible, well, actually it is an intangible thing, making being a woman into something that cannot be clearly defined and talked about. And what they've done is they've actually stripped away anything that makes being a woman special. Because if anybody can be a woman, well, then being a woman is nothing special. If anybody can be X, well, then being X isn't really something to covet. Not something that you should really want to be or think is special about you, because anybody can be a woman. Women are special in ways that men aren't. Men are special in ways that women aren't. And that's something that she recognizes here. But when she talks about, I'm not a cervix owner, I'm not a menstruator or a feeling, what are the two most offensive things that you can call a woman? Because in my opinion, they are the C word and the P word. And I'm not going to say that because this is a family show, but you know which words I'm talking about. Think about it. Why are those words the most offensive ones? Because what they are designed to do is basically take all that is being a woman and whittle it down to the part that I use for sex. I mean, when you distill it down into its bare bones, the reason that people refer to a woman in that way is because they're only interested in one thing. To them, the only thing that a woman is something I can use to sexually pleasure myself. And that's why it's so incredibly offensive. By identifying a woman by just that, what you are doing is degrading her and saying that really you're only good for one thing. Really, being a woman, that's the only thing that makes it important. And that's why it's offensive and belittling, and why people should never use those terms to refer to a woman. And so it's ironic to me that they're actually doing this. Now, they're using nicer scientific language for it, but the truth is they're doing exactly the same thing, aren't they? They're distilling, no, the only thing that this is about is having this part. Well, no, you're not a cervix owner. You're a woman. That's a different thing altogether. It's a different concept altogether, and to suggest otherwise is very belittling. And I do find it interesting that the people that are trying to act as though they're the champions of women, they're the ones that are basically distilling women down into just a sex object. They're the ones that are saying, well, that's really the only thing, that's the only part about your physical body that's important. No, it's not. But isn't that what they're calling them? It is degrading, and people should be offended by it. And then she goes on to say later in a different post, but one that's connected to all this. Calvert says, quote, women birth all people, make up half the population, but less than a third of the seats in the House of Commons are occupied by us. So one of the first things I want you to notice here is she is making an observation about it and seems to be somewhat of a feminist. Now, I don't know if she's just a classical feminist like I am, or she's an actual feminist that believes a whole bunch of the other stuff that came after classical feminism, but just happens to disagree with the transgender movement. I don't know. I don't know the woman well enough to make that call. But the point is, she doesn't sound like somebody that's extremely on the right, and I find that really fascinating. And I predicted a long time ago that eventually lesbians and transgenders would fight with one another. And based on another part of this post where she kind of brings that fight up, it seems as though she seems to be on that bench. She's somebody that's actually in favor of homosexuality. I don't know if that's true or not, but her posts seem to suggest this if you read the whole thing. But if you are somebody that says, oh, I only like women, well, you can't say I only like women if women aren't a thing. And the trannies will refer to you as transphobic if you don't have sex with a woman that has man parts. They're saying, no, I am a woman. Well, no, the whole reason you became a lesbian is because you don't like dude parts. I mean, isn't that the whole point of being a lesbian? I don't agree with lesbianism, obviously. But the point is, it seems like that's kind of the whole reason you become a lesbian. But anyway, this is the fight that is going on. When your starting point of any ideology is utter nonsense, these are the kind of places that you land. You have all kinds of conflicting ideas that don't make sense with one another because they're not rooted in truth. And that's going to be true for the gay community and the transgender community. Eventually, they're going to be at each other's throats, and it's already started in the UK. This is another example of it. But when she talks about women birth all people, that seems to be the thing that was super controversial. There was the tranny mob launched a letter campaign to her employers, to the board of directors that kind of oversaw that organization. One of these letters, one of the critics, that was attacking her and lobbed this against her said that it is, quote, absolutely disgusting language, and then accused her of forgetting that not only women birth children. No, if you birth a child, you're a woman. Dudes can't do it. You may feel like you can birth a child if you're a man, but guess what? It doesn't matter how much you feel that way, it ain't going to happen. And if you're a woman who is pregnant and capable of birthing a child, that's pretty strong evidence you're not a dude. You may feel that way, but you're not. I'm a man, for example. Doesn't matter how much like a woman I feel like, I'm never going to be able to make a baby. That's just not a thing that my body can do. And the reverse is also, of course, true. But the thing that I find funny about this is you would think that the people on the board of this organization would have enough common walking around sense. Of course, they obviously don't. That somebody who is the head of a birth organization, an organization of people that help women through the birth process, would have a little more expertise on who is capable of birthing children than the crazy tranny mob that thinks that they're a gender that they're not. You would think she would have a little more credibility than those people. She's kind of seen a lot of kids be born. Every single one that she's seen born, always a woman without exception, period, end of discussion. There is no reason to even entertain the fact. It is so obviously untrue that it is that a guy with a male body, that a guy with a Y chromosome in his cells, every single cell of his body is saying, nope, you can't have a child. It's not a thing you can do. Sorry. It's not a thing. But somehow we're the anti-science ones. Somehow we, the conservatives, we're the science deniers because we're saying, nope, only a female can have a baby, which is something that the human race has understood since its inception. Same thing with animals. Even the animals understand you got to be female to have a kid. I mean, there's a handful of rare exceptions, but even then, if you're a human being, you have to be female to have a baby. There is no other way around that. But what's important to understand in all this is that the trainee mob has taken it upon themselves to, you indulge us in our delusion or we will ruin your life. And that's exactly what happened here. This is a woman that said, no, I'm not going to say you're a woman just because you feel like a woman. I'm not going to say that you're a woman just because you're telling me that you want to be one. You can't say that you're a woman just because you wear lipstick and put on a dress. I'm not going to indulge you in your delusion that you are a woman. And what did they do? They got her fired. That's not tolerance. Now, granted, tolerance isn't love. That's one of the maxims of our shows. But the point is, the left, who always prides itself on tolerance, they cannot handle people that disagree with them. And if you do, they will try to ruin your life just like they did to this woman. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
And our chaplain's report today does come from the book of 2 Corinthians. And to really understand what's going on in this particular passage, you have to really dig down into the context. The church of Corinth was a good congregation, but like a lot of good congregations, even to this day, they had a lot of problems. And that's part of the reason that they're some of the longest epistles in Paul's letters. Of the letters that we have, and there's good evidence to suggest that we're missing several of Paul's letters, but of the letters that we have that are included in the canon of the Scripture, based on that, you look at the length of the letters, and it's not the longest, but 1st and 2nd Corinthians are among the longest. And there's a good reason for that. It's because there is so much content in there and also a lot of problems that Paul had to address. And because of that, he has to deal with them somewhat sternly. As somebody who is a spiritual leader, and this is something that I can say this as a spiritual leader, nobody likes to do. But sometimes you have to point out that people are doing things wrong. And because of this, Paul has had to be a little bit harsh with them to try to get his point across and explain to them how big of a problem this really is. So let's go ahead and look at this passage in 2 Corinthians 6, 11 through 13. He's talking as a member of the apostles here. So our mouth has spoken freely to you, O Corinthians. Our heart is opened wide. You are not restrained by us, but you are restrained in your own affections. Now, in a like exchange, I speak as to children, open wide to us also. A couple really important things about that passage. Paul is telling them, look, I'm not hiding the ball here. When he says, I speak freely to you, what he's saying there is, I'm not holding anything back. I don't have any ulterior motives. I'm not trying to manipulate you for my own gain. What I am doing, I'm laying my cards out on the table. You're seeing everything that's in my heart. I'm not holding anything back from you. And what he's trying to do is dispel any rumors or dispel anybody saying, Paul's just being mean or nasty, or he's doing this to puff himself up, or no, Paul is saying, I'm telling you everything in my heart. I am leaving it all on the table. And it's up to you to decide what to do with it. But the point is, everything that I want to say to you, I'm saying. I'm not holding back at all. And when you understand that that is what's going on, you know that Paul's intentions are pure. Because somebody that takes the time and effort and energy to write to them, to explain things to them, to care about their day-to-day goings-on, to try to help that church maintain a healthy relationship between themselves, both individually and as a congregation, with Jesus Christ, that is something that is difficult to do. And it takes time, it takes concern. I mean, just think about all that went into writing a letter back then. Everything had to be done by hand. If you made an error, you had to fix it yourself. There was no spell check or anything like that. And so it's a very elaborate process. And what Paul is doing is saying, guys, I am pouring my heart out to you. I'm doing the best that I can. So I don't want rumors flying around out there that Paul's just doing this for his own good or whatever. I'm leaving everything out there for you to see. And also, I'm not hiding things from you. I'm not hiding any secret tips or anything. Every piece of advice that I want to give, that I have to give, is yours. Partake of it freely. And by the way, he's also speaking as the other apostles too, because you'll look that he's using the plural there, that he and other apostles and disciples, probably referring to Titus and Timothy, Titus whom he's actually mentioned specifically by name in this book. He's saying that we're doing everything we can for you, so please pay attention to us and take it to heart. So that's just kind of where Paul is starting out, trying to plead with them to do so. And I think that this is important because sometimes it's just easier to be criticized by a loved one. Granted, sometimes it can drive you crazy, and I understand that too. But there are certain things that a loved one can say, whether it's a parent, a brother or sister, or a really close friend, that if a stranger or somebody that you just met a few days ago said to you, you would go off on them probably. And that's because if it's somebody that has that familiarity with you, that you know has your best interest in heart, you're going to understand that they're not saying it to break you down. They're saying it to build you up. They're saying it because they want you to be better. And that's exactly where Paul is coming from right here. He's not saying these things to discourage the Corinthians. He's not saying this because he wants them to feel bad. He's saying it because he understands there are real spiritual problems that need to be addressed. And that's why I think that he's leading off with this idea of his heart being opened wide to them. He wants them to know, I care about you. This isn't easy for me to do, but I'm doing it because I genuinely believe it's what's best for you. And so I think that's something for us to follow as Christians. If we ever have to be in a situation where we've got to correct a brother or even just a friend, somebody that may not even be in the kingdom yet, but somebody that we know, it doesn't hurt to let them know up front and to mention while we're doing so, hey, look, I really am trying to do what's best for you. I'm not doing this because I want to or because it's fun. Frankly, it probably makes you uncomfortable. So say that. But I really thought it was important enough that I had to say something. That's the approach that Paul is taking here. And you'll notice that at the last part of this, he talks about them and refers to them as children and says that that's the manner in which he is using here. And he says that they are not restrained by his words. There's a great line in one of my favorite movies of all time, First Night. It's a Sean Connery movie. It's not one that people know as well as some of the other ones, but I love it. And there's a line that he says in there that there are laws that enslave men, and there are laws that make them free. You see, Paul is bringing down the hammer a little bit on him here. But the reason he's doing so is because he wants them to be free of the slavery of their own desires and impulses and affections. That's what this verse is saying. He's saying right now you are a slave to your own impulses. You are doing things that are contrary to Christ because it's what your feelings tell you to do. And I think it's hilarious that this actually contrasts the last news story that we got into, but I'm not going to dig too deep into that. But the point is that my words aren't put here to just be some kind of arbitrary shackle around you to keep you from doing what you want to do. See, you doing what you want to do, that's real slavery. You just following every whim and impulse that happens to hit you in the moment, you're no better than an animal then. You are a slave to your own instincts and impulses. The words that I'm trying to give to you, they don't restrain you. Your impulses restrain you. I'm trying to teach you how to rise above that to make your own conscious moral decisions. And then you have true freedom. Then you are truly free to be the person that God made you to be. And so my words aren't here to restrain you. They're here to actually protect your liberty. And I think it's quite impactful that he's talking to them as children, because isn't that what parents do for their children all the time? When you tell them you have to be back home by this time, that's not a rule that's put out there to restrain them or to keep them from having fun, even though it may feel like it at the time. That rule is there to keep them safe and guard their future liberty, and to cause them to make good decisions, to live a better life, one that's more safe, more stable, more responsible. That's exactly the role Paul is playing here, and he basically spells that out to them. He addresses them as children, hoping that they will spiritually mature and, just like a real child, get to the point to where those rules are still in place, but they're self-imposed. They make good decisions on their own. They do things because they understand them to be right, and also because they understand them to really be long-term what is actually beneficial for them. And once they understand that, I think that's where real spiritual maturity starts to set in. And I think that means the lesson for us, the takeaway from us is, when someone is criticizing us, we need to be able to recognize what kind of criticism it is. Are they putting words out there to restrain us, to break us down, to keep us from moving forward? Or are they actually putting those words out there to try to help encourage us to make right decisions and do the right thing? Because if it's constructive criticism, if it's criticism that is meant to build up in the long run, we need to understand that, recognize it, take it to heart, and hopefully apply it to our lives so that we can be better people in the long run too, just like the Corinthians were with Christ, or with Paul. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright